I think the most important thing right now is that the president make it clear that we intend to finish the job.
But what does that even entail, right? I feel like the administration's been murky on what the actual goals of this are.
Well, there's an old saying that one doesn't make peace with one's enemy, one makes peace with one's defeated enemy. And the posture that I see from the Iranians doesn't suggest that they feel defeated right now. I think they largely are.
All right, that was former Vice President Mike Pence weighing in on the war in Iran. It was one of the many topics he discussed in an interview with MS Now senior Capitol Hill reporter Ali Vitale. And Ali joins us now. Man, Ali, a fascinating interview. What more did you learn from the former Vice President?
Yeah, Joe, I was really interested to hear the former vice president weigh in on a number of different issues currently facing President Trump and an administration that Pence was for 4 years a large part of. But one of the things that I asked him, as someone who's covered Pence for a decade and heard him say on the campaign trail hundreds of times that he is a Christian, conservative, and Republican in that order, I asked him directly about President Trump's ongoing feud with the Pope, which seems to have died down, at least briefly. But then, of course, those AI images, specifically that one that the president posted that depicted him as a Jesus-like figure. This is what the former Vice President Mike Pence told me about that.
Well, I found the language and the images offensive. I think the president was right to take that one image down. His ongoing argument with Pope Leo, I think, has abated to a degree, and I welcome that. I think the Pope has every right to express himself in a manner that he believes is consistent with the gospel of Jesus Christ, and the president has every right to express his view and his agenda for the American people. And I think. If I was advising him, as I did every day for 4.5 years, I'd say, let the Pope be the Pope and you be the president.
Have you called him on this or anything else, speaking of advising him?
I have not. The president, I was able to congratulate the president on his election and congratulate the First Lady. But we don't talk as often as we used to, but I get the distinct impression he still listens to us and watches what we do.
Now, Pence says he has that belief, guys, because of the role that Pence has always played in the conservative movement as a stalwart there. That was another part of our conversation that we'll bring to you guys for next week. But I think fascinating to watch Pence there respond to the way the president has talked about the Pope, the images that he's posted online. It's a marked difference from the way that people like Speaker Mike Johnson and even Vice President J.D. Vance have reacted to those moments.
Yeah, it is, Ali. And speaking of J.D. Vance, I know you talked to Vice President Pence about the current vice president and the relationship, or perhaps I should say the lack thereof, between the two.
The lack thereof between the two. And we aired a portion of the interview on my show this morning about the fact that they've actually never spoken, which I think might be shocking. And I even said to the former vice president at one point, you've never spoken to the only other person who knows what it's like to be Donald Trump's vice president. And yet Pence had criticism for J.D. Vance, really through the lens of Vance espousing an isolationist view of how America should comport itself on the world stage. And it was in that window of global dynamics and the role that the U.S. plays right now that I thought this exchange that I had with Pence was really fascinating. We were talking about Iran, yes, as we showed at the top of the show, but also the way that the U.S. is positioned as a leader on the world stage right now. Listen to that part of our conversation. It's interesting that you bring up the role of American leadership on the world stage, because the German chancellor back in February, and this is a quote from him, said the United States' claim to leadership has been challenged and possibly lost. He was citing comments at that point from the vice president and others in the Trump administration during the Munich Security Conference. Do you understand, based on some of the actions from the Trump administration and key figures within it, why that's the view?
Well, I certainly do. I mean, look, I've visited, as you know, Ali, I've visited Ukraine twice since the initiation of hostilities. And I think the military in Ukraine, President Zelensky, have responded with courage and innovation against the overwhelming force of the Russian military. And I truly do believe free nations in the world need to continue to give Ukraine what they need to defeat and repel that Russian invasion.
Is America giving that right now through the Trump administration?
I think that's an open question. I was disappointed to hear my successor recently boasting about the fact that we had ended support for Ukraine.
So once again, there a criticism along an ideological and substantive lane from the former vice president to the current vice president, Joe. But I mean, this show has been bar none on talking about the ways that the U.S. lack of clarity in the Trump administration around Ukraine has ripple effects throughout Europe and the global community. And I think Pence is really directly seizing on that, both in our interview, but then also in the interview pieces to come, where he talks about the ways that the Republican Party could go one of two ways right now. And you and I have talked about this as well, through an isolationist wing espoused by some people like J.D. Vance, or through the more neoconservative traditional view of America as a leader on the global stage, which is something that Pence says he thinks that they can get back and that Republicans will return to.
All right, MS Now senior Capitol Hill reporter and the host of Way Too Early, Ali Vitale, thank you so much. Great interview, and we can't wait to hear the rest of it. David French, listening to Mike Pence, I'm struck. You know, everybody likes to sort of try to define, you know, whether somebody it's an American firster or whether they're neocons or what they are. I just remember growing up in a conservative household. I mean, my dad was a Cold Warrior. My family, we were Cold Warriors. We believed, like Ronald Reagan believed, that you pushed the boundaries of freedom in Europe as far east as you could. And a victory over the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the welcoming of these Warsaw Pact countries that had been enslaved by the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin since 1945, that was something that we celebrated, that we were joyful about. Conservatives were joyful about it. Republicans were joyful about it. And now, I mean, this is, again, it's clearly, you know, it's, people come up to you and say, oh, I liked you when you were conservative. You've got to laugh. You are the conservative one. They're the ones that are, the very ones that are proud, J.D. Vance, that we're not supporting the freedom fighters against Russian invaders, against Russian hordes, against Russian bombs. Like, this is such a trashing, not just of Reagan's legacy, but the legacy of the last 60, 70 years of conservatism. And Mike Pence represents that. I remember the first term, Donald Trump would say something that would, you know, make you scratch your head. It sounded pro-Putin. And then Mike Pence would go over to Europe and he would say, yes, we still support freedom in Europe. We still want to push back on autocracy and let freedom reign in Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. But that is sadly missing from this administration with people like Mike Pence out.
You know, I'm Joe, that's very well said. And I'm utterly stumped by the idea that this reversal on Russia, where now it is the Republican Party that is the weaker party in the United States system on opposing Russian aggression, that I'm stumped by any argument that this is in our national interests. How is it in our national interest to be proud to cut off aid to Ukraine? How is it in our national interest to lavish this attention on Russia in the ongoing whatever's left of a peace process in Ukraine, where we're consistently leaving Ukraine out of the loop, out of the conversation? How is this an American national interest? It is one of the most remarkable 180s that I've ever seen, Joe. I mean, this is a thing for me that it was foundational to my membership in the Republican Party back in those years, as I saw the Republicans as more clear-eyed about the danger of, in that time, Soviet aggression. I never imagined you'd have a time where the Democratic Party was more clear-eyed about Russian aggression. But here we are, and people bandy about words like conservative. There is nothing, this is a theme of the show, nothing conservative, actually conservative about this Republican Party.
David French, thank you as always. David's latest piece for The Times is titled, "I Missed the Part About the Divine Right of Presidents." That piece is up now.